Добрый вечер. Нас не так много, но я бы хотела все равно сказать, что мы сегодня открываем наш новый сезон открытого университета Высшей школы урбанистики. То есть сегодня у нас первая лекция в этом году. Я надеюсь, что... Точнее, я знаю, что наша программа в этом году будет очень насыщенная и интересная. Вот, так что следите за анонсами, приходите. Сейчас я хочу передать слово Михаилу, который уже представит сегодняшнюю.
Спасибо. Ну, наверное, я буду говорить по-английски. Окей, буду говорить по-английски. We sort of very randomly met Joao a couple of weeks ago in Lvov, of all places, at a conference that was organized by the Second World Balance Network, and we were on the same panel. And I spoke so long in my paper, which was first, that there was no time for Joao to finish his presentation. So basically, this is an opportunity for me to hear the rest of Joao's presentation, which was impeded by my kind of lack of respect for the order of the events. But it was a fantastic presentation, and and I think this is a talk that's very relevant to the predicament, this bizarre, or rather, I mean, very interesting outburst of iconoclasm, which has happened in the last few years, starting, for example, in Ukraine with the Leninopad, and then moving, perhaps it wasn't the same phenomenon, but then reoccurring in South Africa with the controversies over monuments to Rhodes and other sort of colonial figures in South Africa, then ending up then moving sort of via the UK. There were all these debates about Cecil Rhodes statues in Oxford, and this Rhodes must fall movement. And I think eventually they put up a little plaque next to the Rhodes bust in Oxford saying that he was a bad man, but they can't pull the plaque down because that would be too radical. And then ending up in the US, where in the last few weeks something like 20 or 30, or even more perhaps, Confederate monuments have been pulled down since the events of Charlottesville. So you have this sort of this kind of this monument, and what to do with it in the traditional understanding of the sense has sort of turned itself into a very hot topic once again. So Joao is going to speak about what these monuments to Jose Marti can tell us in Havana. So just to briefly introduce him, he defended his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, and now I think spent a few years teaching in the States, and now teaches at the University of Sao-Paulo, and concentrates on, has various research concentrating on both Latin America, Cuba, and also to some extent on Eastern Europe. But this is your first trip to Moscow, right? So,
yep.
So exciting stuff. Has published in various in publications in numerous languages, in Howe, Journal of Ethnographic Theory, in a number of Portuguese, Brazilian publications, which I'm not going to pronounce the names of. And this publication is in Bulgarian, I think, the first one, isn't it?
Yeah, there is one in Bulgarian.
There is one in Bulgarian. So, anyway, so now he's going to talk to us, a talk titled "Can the Statue Speak? Monuments and Political Ventriloquism in Havana." By the way, just before I let you begin, I did the same thing as I was a few weeks ago. This talk will, I mean, these I suppose these seminar series happen at Pushkar on Wednesdays normally. The next talk next Wednesday will be my talk about Warsaw, about methodological, ethnographic methodology in Warsaw and Moscow, and it will also be a talk to sort of announce this workshop series that I'll be running with Sasha Strekotov, who is not here, I think. So if any of you are at Vishka, then please come next week to this talk. So anyway, I think I would like to hear more from you at this stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michal. Thank you all for coming. Thanks a lot to the Moscow Higher School of Economics for inviting me, and for the Dostoevsky Library too. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay. For several personal reasons, I always say that I study Cuba because the Soviet Union fell. So in a way, so it's particularly moving to be here in Moscow, and in a city where monuments matter so much. Anyway, so let me go talk about Cuba then. So let me start by describing a monument and telling a joke about it. The monument is the one you can see in this image. It lies by the Havana seashore, which right now is completely flooded, by the way. It lies in front of the United States diplomatic representation in Cuba. The monument shows Cuba's foremost national hero, Jose Marti, holding a young boy and pointing accusatively towards the building that for decades was called the U.S. Interest Section and recently regained its original status as the U.S. Embassy. No Cuban would doubt the official meaning of the monument. Jose Marti, the most celebrated symbol of Cuban nationhood, is protecting the Cuban future and accusing the U.S. of putting Cuba's sovereignty in danger. As if it was not clear enough, a plaque on the statue's pedestal displays quotes by Marti denouncing U.S. imperialist ambitions in Latin America. This statue was dedicated in April 2000, in the middle of the affair surrounding Gonsalvis. I don't know how well known this is around here, but it was Gonsalvis was a boy who shipwrecked when his mother was taking him from Havana to Miami, and who became the target of a 7-month-long judicial dispute between his father in Cuba and his exiled family in Miami. A dispute which, as you know, became a dramatic performance of the political struggle between the socialist state and its emigre opponents. When I interviewed the sculptor of the statue, he told me that the boy that Marti is holding could be seen as either Marti's actual son or Elian Gonzalez himself, for, in his words, Elian is Marti's son as well. At the ceremony of dedication of this monument, the main speech was delivered by the first secretary of Cuba's communist youth, who said, open quote, "In all the protests for the return of Elian, Marti has been present through the constant evocation of the speakers, and now he is also present in this plaza. His figure rises in this place, accompanied by the affection of a boy who may be his son or may be Elian." Marti's finger accusing the empire tells us that we shall have no rest while we are confronting the enemy that despises us. This plaza, he continued, is a reaffirmation of the anti-imperialist and socialist character of our struggle, end of quote. This young leader was publicly instituting the monument as a presentification of Marti himself, and at the same time performing the first act of ventriloquism that institution made possible. By speaking below and in front of the effigy of the hero, which he proclaimed to be Marti himself, he was associating official state discourse with that effigy, or, in other words, trying to give authority to official discourse by giving voice to the monument. For years, until at least Fidel Castro's retirement, numerous mass demonstrations against U.S. imperialism have been taking place in the esplanade between the statue and the U.S. Interest Section, or Embassy. This area is officially called the Anti-Imperialist Tribune. But Havanans like to sarcastically call it the Protestodromo, the Protestodrome. Invariably, speakers in these events have given to Marti's monuments the official voice of the state, according to which socialism and nationalism are inseparable, because only socialism has been able to protect Cuba's sovereignty against foreign intervention. However, several times, Havanans of different generations and social and racial backgrounds have told me a joke that puts other words in Marti's mouth. This popular joke says that the hero is actually telling the boy, "Let's go there, son. Let's get a visa. Let's get out of here." This joke is a subversive act of ventriloquism, which attributes to the statue words that contradict state discourse. Instead of accusing the U.S. in order to protect the boy, in this joke, Marti's effigy gains voice to announce his intention to leave the island for the U.S. and to take Cuba's future with him. So my talk today discusses major monuments to Jose Marti in Havana and different attempts to give authority to political views by associating them with those effigies. I will focus mainly on political speeches and jokes. Not to reproduce a stark dichotomy between official and popular discourses, but to show their mutual implications and to point to the importance of urban space in the production of political compliance and nationalistic imaginations. I am particularly interested in monuments as material interventions in the urban landscape, as objects that have an important political role and help create public places. The idea of political ventriloquism is also a way of examining the way in which people use objects in social life. In Reassembling the Social, Bruno Latour, an anthropologist who works a lot on the social life of things, he says, open quote, "To be accounted for, objects have to enter into account. If no trace is produced, they offer no information to the observer and will have no visible effects on other agents. They remain silent and are not actors. This is why specific tricks have to be invented to make them talk." End of quote. I intend to contribute here to the understanding of these tricks to make objects talk, and specifically to their relationship to urban space. I will start by giving a historical background about Jose Marti and his relevance in Cuba today. I will then discuss several Havana monuments dedicated to him and the acts of official political ventriloquism that regularly uses them. Next, I will analyze jokes about these monuments as alternative modalities of political ventriloquism. I will point to the limitations of jokes as subversive media of political communication, arguing that they help authorize and consolidate the state power that they seem to attack. This will allow me to conclude by stressing once again the importance of public objects and urban spatial interventions in the production of nationalism and political compliance. Jose Marti was a Cuban writer, starting with his life, a Cuban writer and political leader who lived between 1853 and 1895. His cutting-edge prose and poetry earned him a prominent place in the history of Spanish-language literature, and he played a major role in the Cuban anti-colonial struggle against Spain. Due to his nationalist writings and involvement in the pro-independence movement, he spent most of his life in exile in Spain, Guatemala, Mexico, and above all in New York City, where he settled down in 1880. In New York, Marti worked as a multifaceted intellectual. He was a translator, a journalist, essayist, and poet. It was also there that he created the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which brought together most factions of the independence movement. After years of preparation, the armed rebellion against Spain started in 1895, and Marti himself landed in Cuba to join the fight. However, he survived little more than a month on the island. He was killed in his first encounter with colonial troops. By attacking the Spaniards alone, wearing a black suit on a white horse in the middle of green bushes, he somehow performed the sacrificial death that he had so often called for in his writings. But the War of Independence went on after Marti's death and ended in 1898, when the U.S. intervened in a conflict in what became known as the Spanish-American War. After occupying the island for 4 years, the United States finally granted Cuba official sovereignty in 1902. Soon after independence, Jose Marti started being celebrated as Cuba's greatest national hero and being respectfully called the Apostle. In a vibrant commemorative postmodern life, he was made into one of the nation's most cherished symbols. From the early 20th century to this day, no political movement has emerged in Cuba that has not claimed Marti as its inspiration. Each and all of them, across the political spectrum, have portrayed themselves as the real successors of Marti, the ones who would make his dreams come true. This dispute over the interpretation of Jose Marti has stimulated, and was in turn stimulated by, various sorts of commemoration. In political speeches, statues, museums, art exhibitions, literary contests, classrooms, and civic rituals, Marti was celebrated as the greatest incarnation of nationhood. Nothing, however, has fostered, strengthened, and expanded the cult of Jose Marti in Cuba as much as the regime established by the Revolution of 1959. Since the beginning of the insurrection against dictator Fulgencio Batista, the revolutionaries had claimed to be fighting for Marti's ideals. When Fidel Castro was imprisoned in 1953 for the first armed attack he led against Batista, the mythologized attack on the Moncada barracks, he was asked who was the intellectual author of the act, and to this Fidel boldly replied, Jose Marti. Marti gained thus one of his most famous accolades, the intellectual author of the Moncada attack, which is tantamount to saying the intellectual author of the revolution. And the photograph that Fidel Castro took in the courtroom that day, as you can see here, he posed as if he was being blessed by Marti, became one of the most famous and widely circulated images in Cuban history. Here, for instance, you see a poster that was displayed in Havana in 2008, 2009. So it shows an elderly Fidel being inspired by a young Fidel being inspired by Marti. Well, it's no coincidence that Fidel Castro was buried a few meters away from Marti's mausoleum in Santiago de Cuba last year. For over 5 decades, the Cuban state has made tireless efforts to make the image of Marti indissociable from the regime and its leadership. The figure of Marti was converted into the master symbol of the socialist state. It's like Lenin here, and has saturated Havana's public sphere. His image and his words have been an inescapable part of Cubans' everyday and ritual life since 1959. Widely reproduced political speeches often quote Marti as a source of moral and political authority. Stopped working. Oh, okay. Maybe I missed it anyway. So children at school recite Marti's poems in numerous times. And every morning they are ritually gathered in front of a bust of Marti to pledge their commitment to be pioneers for communism. In the 90s, only one model of TV set was sold in Cuba. And every single time one turns it on, to this day, for 30 seconds, it displays a quotation of Marti over a black background before showing anything else. Prizes awarded to distinguished students, schools and workers and work centers display images and quotations of Jose Marti, which also frequently show up in radio and television shows. In a country where clothing articles have been either hard to find or too expensive to buy, many low-income Cubans wear t-shirts with images and quotations of the hero. So here are children getting their first blue kerchief as pioneers in front, taking pictures proudly in front of the bust of Marti. Marti's faces and quotations also appear in billboards, in countless posters like this one, and in mural, this one, inviting people to cut sugarcane, or in big murals like this one on the city's main bus station. In all of these medias, the basic message has been the same. The revolution is a continuation of the 19th century anti-colonial struggles, and socialism is the culmination of Marti's nationalist and anti-imperialist thought and struggle. Not surprisingly, monuments are among the various medias that have been largely used to transmit this official message. And here I move to the second section of my talk. Even before the revolution, a monument to Marti in downtown Havana had come to symbolize Cuban sovereignty. And the socialist state has used different monuments to Marti so intensively that they have come to signify for most Havanans the very presence and power of the state in the city. More than that, monuments to Marti have obtained through the repeated use an inextricable relationship with sovereign power itself. To make that argument, I will first jump back in time and present the first monuments to Marti ever built in Havana. This one there, which was dedicated in 1905 in a plaza, in a square called Parque Central, best translated as Central Plaza. At that time, as today, the plaza enjoyed a remarkable visibility in the urban fabric. It has several of the elements that, according to the geographer Kevin Lynch, gives an urban place an important role in the way in which a city is visualized, imagined, and is experienced. First, that's the location of the central square in the city. To the left, to the right, that's the colonial core of Havana, and to the right is the more 20th century center of the city. So first, this plaza is a major path. It's the busiest square in downtown Havana today as in 1905. Thousands of people cross it every day. Second, it is located along a major urban edge at the center of a series of boulevards that divide the city's old colonial core, here, right? And the newer shopping and entertainment district that developed in the 20th century. Third, it is a central node in the city where several major commercial streets converge. Fourth, even before the installation of Marti's statue, Parque Central already boasted several landmarks, including Havana's first ice cream parlor, its most popular cafe, and its largest theater. Actually, the significance of Marti's statue comes partly from the fact that it replaced an older important landmark. For the last 5 decades of the Spanish rule, its spot had been occupied by a statue of the Queen of Spain, which you can see in this historic picture. With the American occupation of the island, the Queen was removed, the Queen of Spain was removed, to be briefly replaced by a Statue of Liberty inspired by that of New York City. With the advent of national sovereignty, Cuba's most widely read magazine, El Figaro, launched a survey to find out which figure its readers thought should now occupy the site. The chosen character was Jose Marti, and thanks to money-raising efforts among the city's elite and the strong support of the new government, the monument to Marti was dedicated there in 1905. The replacement of the Spanish Queen by Marti points to the role of national heroes as substitutes of the dynastic monarchs as symbolic human embodiments of sovereign power. In dynastic monarchies, the sovereign is a person whose body can be easily reproduced in stone. But in a nationalist context, the sovereign is supposed to be an abstract imagined community that is also the collectivity over which the state rules. This abstract sovereign, the nation, or the people, cannot easily be represented in a human bodily form, and this is what the production of national hero allows for. National heroes embody an otherwise elusive national sovereignty. In the case of Cuba, it was Marti who provided that new embodiment, as exemplified in an almost didactic way by the replacement of the monument to the Queen by a monument to the hero. The dedication of this monument in 1905 was a large public spectacle centered on political speeches and a military parade. The event dramatized sovereign power by separating 3 major groups. 1, those who can exercise sovereign power, the top state authorities that occupied a stand. 2, those through whom sovereign power can be exercised, the parading military. And 3, those over whom sovereign power can be exercised, the general public, described as the people. More than that, the political ventriloquism performed that day, and I'm talking about 1905 again, next to Marti's statue, proclaimed that the hero's great deed was Cuba's national sovereignty itself. And revealingly, the main speaker, the president of Cuba himself, solemnly declared, Marti, this statue is him. So just like the leader of the communist youth would say 95 years later, the president was dedicating an effigy of the hero by associating it to national sovereignty and by proclaiming it to be the hero himself. It's not stone, it's the hero. The association of this object with national sovereignty increased in the 1920s and 30s when the presidential palace and the Capitol were built each a few blocks away from it, placing Central Plaza exactly halfway between the seats of the executive and legislative branches of government. It is no wonder that on January 1st, 1959, when the crowds flocked to the streets of Havana to celebrate the fall of Fulgencio Batista and the victory of the revolutionaries, the most prominent celebration took place in Central Plaza. That's a picture from 1959, the day of the triumph of the revolution, when flags of Cuba and the revolutionary movement were hung from the effigy to the national hero. The following year, 1960, however, the monument was at the center of one of the few anti-socialist protests of the early revolutionary period. A Soviet official visited the island for the first time, Vice Premier Anastas Mikoyan. I'm using the Cuban pronunciation. He performed the customary diplomatic ritual. He laid a wreath of flowers at the foot of Marti's statue and made a short speech. So that's a wreath of flowers with a hammer and sickle. He praised both, in his speech, Mikoyan praised both the Russian and the Cuban revolutions as expressions of popular sovereignty. At this time, the Cuban Revolution had not been officially declared socialist. The Cuban government was actually denying that this was a socialist revolution until the following year, 1961. Mikoyan's act of ventriloquism was not welcome by everybody. Minutes after the ceremony, 100 students tried to replace the Soviet wreath, which had the shape of a hammer and sickle, as you can see, with one that they brought, shaped as the Cuban flag. Against Mikoyan's ventriloquism, they presented their own, in the form of posters that said, "Revolution, yes. Socialism, no." And "Fidel, yes. Lenin, no." They were enraged by the Soviet homage to Marti, which they saw as an affront to national sovereignty. Equally enraged, but far more numerous, were the supporters of the government who attacked the protesters, leading to a generalized shootout and riot. The young protesters were arrested, and the frenzied crowd shouted, demanding that they be executed. The protesters were freed the following day, but the event showed the extent to which, for all parties involved, that monument had come to embody Cuban nationhood. And this is why it made sense to fight so much over it. In fact, around the same time, similar riots were happening in Miami and New York by different political groups who wanted to use Jose Marti either for or against the revolution, for or against socialism, and with different combinations of that. But Havana's first statue of Marti lost much of its association with sovereignty when the revolutionary regime removed the central state institutions from its surroundings and transferred them to a new location a few kilometers southwest of downtown. So that's like the original downtown, and this is the new square and the monument that was built actually by Batista, but it started being used by the socialist government. In this area, at the geographic center of the metropolis, a complex of buildings was being constructed by the Batista regime to house key cultural and juridical buildings and institutions. But the revolutionary government made of that complex its political headquarters. And this new socialist political center also had a monument to the national hero. In fact, its most central and conspicuous element of this new square is this giant monument to Marti, composed of a statue that is 18 meters high and an obelisk that soars to the height of 110 meters. It is this monument that came to be mostly associated with the sovereignty in Cuba. It is the public face of the headquarters of Cuba's executive power. Behind the monument lies the large building that houses the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the Council of Ministers, and the State Council. All three institutions presided by Fidel Castro in 2008, and now by his brother Raul. But the monument totally conceals the main facade of this building. One has to literally go behind Marti's statue and take the elevator to an observatory at the top floor of the obelisk to actually see that building. So that's the big building that's the center of power in Cuba that you can only see from the top of the monument. The backside of the building cannot be seen from ground level either, because, as you can see in this picture, it's surrounded by a dense green area that are called Marti's Woods. Therefore, evocations of the hero conceal the key site of Cuban political power on all its sides. This play of visibility and invisibility is made more intricate by the fact that this observatory on the monument makes of Marti's obelisk a Foucauldian panopticon. This phallic structure, Havana's highest building, provides a privileged vantage point from which most of the city can be observed. These photos show how the city can be seen from that observatory, and here you can see how the obelisk looms over much of the city. This panoptical character has not escaped Havanans, who have spread rumors that surveillance cameras are installed on the obelisk walls, as if one could never escape the gaze of the state, materialized by a monument to Marti. Another popular story that people tell in Havana is that the main reason for the shortage of beef in Cuba is the fact that for as long as Fidel Castro lived, he would sacrifice a cow every day inside that monument to his Afro-Cuban deity, and that's why nobody else would have beef, because all the cows had to go to Fidel's personal deities. But, Marti's monument faces one of the largest plazas in the world. Measuring nearly 800,000 square feet, it is officially called Plaza de la Revolución Jose Marti Revolution Square. Besides the National Library and the National Theater, the plaza is also home to the two crucial institutions responsible for the use of violence by the state: the Ministry of the Armed Forces and the Ministry of the Interior, shown in this picture. Here, more than anywhere else, a monument to Marti and as you can see, to Che Guevara too, is physically associated with sovereign power, which is ultimately a power over life and death. Besides being home to some of the city's biggest landmarks and being located at its highest natural elevation, the plaza exacerbates the elements that I mentioned earlier, which, according to Kevin Lynch, makes a place especially visible in the urban fabric. First, it is a supernode where several major thoroughfares converge from all directions. This also turns the sides of the square into superpaths, where thousands of Havanas have to pass by when moving between different areas of the city. Third, the square conforms a super edge that creates a border between some of the city's most populous and dense neighborhoods, which surround the area on all of its sides. As such, the plaza helps delimit different districts, the fifth kind of element that, according to Kevin Lynch, make up the image of the city. The area of the plaza cannot be said to be a district in itself, but interpreted as something even more visible. It is an anti-district, because it creates a patch of open space in the middle of the city's dense fabric of neighborhoods. Contrasting to the lively pedestrian traffic that occupies most of the surrounding city, the square remains empty, mostly empty nearly every day. Thousands of people pass by or around the plaza, but very few cross it on a regular day. Those who do, like you might see someone there in the picture, are actually tourists. Cubans are stopped when they try to cross the square. They have to use the surrounding sidewalks. All this makes of the square that houses the top state institutions a unique urban place, distinguished from the rest of the city by the interruption of its predominant urban patterns. As such, Plaza de la Revolución and its buildings help give a material and spatial expression to that otherwise abstract and elusive entity called the state. However, for over 5 decades, the plaza has been the stage of the most important political public events of socialist Cubas, which on special days have filled its vast space with an enthusiastic crowd. That's the reception to Brezhnev when he visited Cuba on January 28, 1974. January 28th is Marti's birthday, and Brezhnev's visit was scheduled to coincide with that date. On these big occasions of big crowds on the plaza, an inversion occurs. It is a city that's half emptied and paralyzed, where the plaza throbs with a large part of Havana's population. Until Fidel Castro retired, these spectacular events easily brought over 1 million people to the plaza, in a city whose population today is around 2.5 million. The most regular public spectacle that has been taken here is the celebration of May Day, an annual ritual that since 1959 has been Havana's most important patriotic commemoration. On this day, a long parade of people passes by the image of Marti, while political leaders and official guests watch from the tribune in front and below the effigy of the hero. These are some pictures from one of the May Days I was present in. The celebration concludes with speeches by one or several political leaders, delivered from that privileged position. Well, I was going backwards. Let's go. Oh, no, that's fine. That's working, I think. The clear spatial structure of this ritual creates a triangle between the crowd, the political leaders, and the effigy of the hero. Filling the plaza is the crowd, repeatedly presented by official discourse as the people of Cuba. Facing them are, on the one hand, the very embodiment of national sovereignty, the effigy of Jose Marti, and on the other, the so-called authorities of the state and the party. The authorities are thus immediately aligned with the hero and literally stand between him and the people, creating a form of mediation between them. Or, to say it from a different perspective, the hero effigy presides over the simultaneous encounter and separation between the two groups, the authorities and the people. The May Day celebration is thus a ritual of sovereignty, which publicly performs a separation and a hierarchy between those who do exercise sovereign power, the authorities, and those who are supposed to be the ultimate sovereign, but are in fact the subjects of sovereign power. there is the people. The same structure has underlain the many important moments of collective effervescence that have brought large crowds to the plaza, like many military parades, the celebration of the end of the 1961 literacy campaign, the visit of Brezhnev, as I mentioned, and the viewing of the remains of Che Guevara in 1997. Another key similarity between all these events is the fact that they invariably include speeches delivered below and in front of the Jose Marti effigy. When I was reading the reports by the Cuban press of the first mass spectacle to ever take place at the plaza on May Day 1959, that was the first May Day after the triumph of the revolution, I was surprised to find out that the first speech delivered there declared that Marti's giant effigy signified the presence of the hero himself, just like the speeches delivered in 1905 and the speech in 2000. So like three historical moments, the dedication of three different monuments, people independently, like the president of Cuba and then a minister in 1959 and then the president of the Communist Youth in 2000, mentioned that the statue somehow was not just a statue, but the hero himself. So in 1959, it was the Minister of Labor who declared that identity. After greeting all authorities sharing the tribune with him, he pointed to the monument behind him and added, open quote, "We greet another figure who is also present here. We greet, ladies and gentlemen, the apostle of Cuban independence who honors us with his presence here tonight." End of quote. Since the speech of the Cuban president in 1905 and this 1959 speech by the Minister of Labor are not well known and were reproduced only in the press of the time, one can conclude that it is not the imitation of a previous example, but an underlying symbolic logic that led those different speakers to proclaim that these effigies of Marti were not mere pieces of sculpted stone, but the very hero himself. These declarations open the sequence of the many acts of political ventriloquism that have subsequently taken place next to these monuments. And no effigy of Jose Marti has been made speak so often and so influentially as the one on Plaza de la Revolución. It was here, in mass spectacles like the ones I mentioned, that Fidel Castro delivered the majority of his most important speeches at a tribune that you can see in the picture. For the audience looking at Fidel from the plaza, the hero loomed over the leader, as if illuminating him. Marti's thoughtful face may have remained silent, but Fidel gave voice to the effigy, which thus gave its prestigious approval to the state discourse. All fundamental points of that discourse have been repeatedly made below and next to Marti's effigy. The social and economic successes of socialism, the continued threat and resistance to American imperialism, the ad infinitum struggle for a better future, the friendship with other socialist and other Latin American nations, the heroism of 1950s revolutionaries, etc. And Marti's effigy will also bless the official interpretations of the most important events of Cuban history since 1959, from the victory over the Bay of Pigs invaders to the recent market-oriented reforms. What few people know is that it was Fidel Castro himself who took the decision in 1959 to have a tribune built in front of the effigy, from which he and other leaders could make speeches and preside over political spectacles. And it was only 4 years after Fidel's, God, I keep mixing them up, after Fidel's resignation in 2012, that a non-political multitudinous event was centered at a stage in front of Marti's monument. That was the mass. That's the one. Okay. Whoops. Okay. I think I got it. Yeah. So the first event that took place in front of the monument was in 2000. That was not political. Was in 2012. Was the mass by then Pope Benedict XVI. However, the Pope did not speak from the tribune, but from a temporary altar that created separation between him and Marti's monument. And the two other non-political mass events that had brought crowds to the plaza had a peculiar special arrangements. The masses prayed by John Paul II in 1998 and by Pope Francis in 2015, as well as the mega concert of the Colombian pop singer Juanes in 2009, was centered on specially built stages in front of the National Library. Therefore, they could not be taking place in front of the tribune. They had to be sideways and facing another side of the library, of the square, and not the monument. Each of these events attracted an alleged 1 million people to the plaza, but they were denied the direct blessing of Marti's statue and had to take place at a 90-degree angle to the hero. The effigy could only be made to speak official political rhetoric. It could not be associated with this discourse of the popes or the Pope. The two monuments I have focused on so far, the one in Parque Central and the one in Plaza de la Revolución, are indexical of sovereign power, mainly in what I would call its internal dimension. That is, the relationship of state power to the subjects over whom it rules. But sovereignty also has an external dimension, which resides in the affirmation of a state's autonomy in relation to other states. And this dimension is best represented in Havana by the monument to Marti that I showed you in the beginning of this talk, in front of the US Embassy. As I mentioned before, this monument is supposed to affirm Cuba's independence in relation to its greatest foreign threat. So these are the locations of the two previous monuments. This location of the third monument dedicated in 2000. These different locations in the urban landscape express a different aspect of sovereignty that they emphasize. Whereas the two other monuments are located in the middle of the city on its internal edges and nodes, Marti's latest monument is located on the city's most visible and prominent external edge, the seashore boulevard that runs along the city's coast and which is, of course, also an edge of national territory. This boulevard, the Malecón, is a busy path in the city and is heavily used as a site of leisure where Havana spend long hours socializing with family, friends, and lovers, talking, drinking, flirting, listening to music, and dancing. Okay. So the monument on Malecón leads me to the next section of my talk. I'll try to be brief. On jokes as a form of political ventriloquism. As I said earlier, this monument to Marti is the main, it's not this picture, the previous one, but this monument to Marti is the main character in a very popular joke in which the statue points to the US diplomatic representation and says, "Let's go there, son, let's get a visa and get out of here." This joke subverts the official discourse of an anti-imperialist Marti and turns him into a potential migrant. Oh, thank you, that's it, thank you. Good. This move of making an effigy of Marti speak and turn its voice against state discourse operates in two other jokes that I heard several times in Havana, and apparently one of them is important from the Soviet Union, so maybe some of you might have heard it, but anyway. So one of the jokes goes like that. Fidel Castro gets to Revolution Square and finds out that Marti's statue is not there. He mobilizes state security agents, and they find out that the statue has actually moved to Miami. A shocked Fidel gets the phone, calls Marti, and asks him, "Apostle, how could you do this to me? How could you abandon the country?" And Marti answers, "Why are you surprised? For decades you kept me silent in that square, and here they even gave me a radio station." The reference here is to Radio Marti, a radio station owned by the US government and operated by Cuban exiles, which constantly sends an oppositional message to the island. Marti here is not only portrayed as being on the other side, where he supposedly can speak freely, but also as protesting the fact that he had been silenced for so long as a monument. The second joke also uses political ventriloquism, and this is the one that I think is important from the Soviet Union, but also uses political ventriloquism to put protests in the mouth of the Plaza Monument. It tells that Fidel Castro is walking on the square, and Marti's statue tells him, "Hey, you, go get me a horse. I'm tired of being here in this position. I want an equestrian statue." A frightened Fidel runs into his palace and tells his brother Raúl that the statue just talked to him. Raúl does not believe Fidel and decides to go back with his brother to the square. The moment the two brothers show up in front of the monument, Marti's statue tells Fidel, "Oh no, I asked you for a horse, not an ass." So in this joke, Marti's statue complains about his immobility and pokes fun at the revolutionary leaders, especially at Raúl's supposed lack of intelligence. These jokes are part of a popular oral humor, especially political humor, that flourishes in Cuba that is often called choteo. This systematic cynical humor puts into ridicule the most serious objects and is manifested in the jokes that circulate on the island at an impressive speed, told by people of different generations and backgrounds. These jokes subvert state discourse in an irreverent and intelligent way, and ruthlessly criticize political leaders. But Marti is rarely a character in them. This is in itself an indication that his figure may be like a hard core of Cuban nationalism that seems hardly touched by choteo, a zone of seriousness that very few seem willing to subvert. Most importantly, it is remarkable that in these few jokes, the protagonist is not Marti as a person, but Marti materialized in a monument that suddenly gains voice and subverts state discourse. This is a very perceptive humorous strategy because it inverts the repeated acts of political ventriloquism performed by political leaders and momentarily defies the state monopoly on the right to make the statue speak. This ventriloquism is also incisive because it brings together two media of political communication that are in many ways mutually opposed. Monuments and jokes are so opposed that they're nearly perfect structural inversions of each other. Where monuments are inscriptions in the urban landscape, in contexts such as contemporary Cuba, political jokes are not publicly inscribable in any way. Monuments are visible and tangible, related to sight and touch. Jokes are spoken and heard, related to speech and hearing. Monuments are official. Jokes are vernacular. Monuments are immobile. Jokes mobile. People circulate around monuments. Jokes circulate among people. Monuments are serious and seldom laugh. Jokes erode seriousness and produce laughter. Monuments inhabit space. Jokes inhabit time. To use Marx's words, monuments are solid, whereas jokes melt into air. So I'm going to just make a very quick, I know I've been too long already, but I'll try to not read, but summarize what I have to say. A little bit more, but basically my argument is that these jokes seem very subversive because they basically they invert the state discourse and give an oppositional content to the monuments and make them speak in a different way that's actually against the state and not for the state as it's traditionally used in political speeches. But what I argue is that the subversive power of jokes is actually not real. And here I'm going to read a little bit more and explain why. None of these jokes ridicule Marti like jokes about revolutionary leaders do. By portraying Marti only as a monument, the jokes save him, Marti, from criticism and ridicule, and leave the fundaments of the cult of Marti untouched. His association with national sovereignty, his immaculate ethics, the value of his political and moral visions. More than that, by making Marti's effigy speak, these jokes reinforce his authority, because it is his own authoritative voice that criticizes his monumentalization and the use that the state makes of his image. So basically, they're not criticizing Marti at all, they're criticizing his use and monumentalization by the state. Those jokes, thus, are humorous versions of a comment that I heard in Cuba over and over again that says, if Marti resurrected today, he would hate to see what politicians do to him. It's a comment, by the way, that people say in Miami as well, referring to the Miami political elite. Like these jokes, this recurrent comment turns the Marti myth against those who manipulate it for supposedly selfish political purposes. But it also reinforces his mythical status by positing the supposed view of the hero as the standpoint from which to criticize contemporary politics. So Marti remains the authoritative voice from which political judgments can be made. The jokes that give voice to Marti monuments do precisely the trick imagined by that comment that they made a stone man resurrect and express his dissatisfaction with the way in which he's used politically. In other words, these jokes subvert the state's appropriation of Marti, but not the mythic status of the hero himself. Their subversion of official representations have thus a clear limit. Political humor gets close to Marti, but does not really touch him. Again, the celebration of Marti is a core where Choteo can hardly enter. So basically, my argument is that even though these jokes try to give a different meaning to the monuments themselves are still controlled by the state. And therefore, when they reinforce the myth of Marti, they end up reinforcing the very authoritative voice of the state as well. Just a line of conclusion here. The control of spatial interventions by the state is so strict in Cuba that even unusual manifestations of support for the government by means of urban space can be problematic. In January 2009, a middle-aged friend of mine, who was a staunch revolutionary enthusiast, took the initiative to paint quotations of Marti on the asphalt of the major street on which he lives. Marti's birthday parade was going to pass on his street the following day, and he wanted to express his support of the government by inscribing revolutionary quotations decoratively on the asphalt of the street, on the pavement. To his surprise, at night, his decorations were painted over with white paint, and he was briefly detained and interrogated. The state security officers implied that he wrote Marti's words on the ground as a form of protest, in order to make people march on the quotations of the apostle. So because Raúl Castro would be walking on that street, so they're saying, oh, you're making this to show that Raúl is actually stepping on Marti's words. These inscriptions were not a monument proper and had definitely no oppositional content. The whole point of my friend was actually to support the revolution. But precisely for that reason, their sad ending is a good indication of the political importance of urban space. This is a highly controlled area, an area where people should not be playing with. Because written and material representations of the myth are so controlled and can never be admittedly subversive, when ventriloquizing jokes reproduce the cult of Marti, they give renewed authority to the monuments that presentify the hero and to the official political ventriloquism that makes constant use of them. By contributing to reproduce the hegemonic Marti mythology, these jokes unexpectedly help reproduce the state's political project. The different tricks to make monuments talk that I analyzed here have thus different efficacies according to their actual possibilities of using monuments, not only orally, but also materially and spatially. The quasi-invisibility of ventriloquizing jokes poses a serious limit to their effects. Their immateriality proves too weak for the visibility, solidness, and persistence of the monuments, whereas official political ventriloquism keeps the monopoly of the association of these public objects in their concreteness and spatiality. Thank you. Yeah, just cut short a little bit. Sorry if I spoke too much. Taking revenge.
Thank you very well. There's, just also so many Warsaw associations that I would sort of very happily to talk at great length about now, but I won't. But I mean, in terms of sort of what happens in the parade square outside of Master Culture, the papal masses that occurred there in 1987. There was a sort of large papal mass outside the Palace of Culture. John Paul II visited, and there was this whole discussion about whether or not to. Initially, the idea was to put a cross on the actual Palace of Culture, and this was
like on the top.
Just to hang a 70-meter high cross off the facade of the palace, rather than actually putting it on the spire. And that was the project officially submitted by the designer to the authorities, but it was almost passed, but then it was rejected by means of a phone call from the Soviet embassy saying that they didn't want any holy trinkets hung from their present, from their gift it was still their gift, it was still in their ownership, and they had the capacity to protest against hanging those crucifixes. So in the end, they designed the designer designed this sort of stage, vaguely shaped like a kind of avant-garde crucifix, which was represented as having which kind of subversively seized the palace's geometry. And there were all these cartoon representations of the palace taking off into as a spaceship escaping from the power of this people. And I mean, also, Alexa, you went to the Lenin Mausoleum today, didn't you?
Yeah.
And all of this stuff about the different uses of Marti made me think of your Chuck's Bodies of Lenin text, which you may have come across. So. But anyway, I want to see if there's if anybody else has any other questions or suggestions or other things that we might think about in relation to.
Can I just mention one thing before each Lenin?
Yeah, no, you got my.
It's just that the key difference here is that Marti is also a non-socialist hero, right? So in Miami, he's as revered, and there's even more monuments to Marti in Miami than in Havana. So, and that's the big difference. And he was there before. So this plaza was built by the previous government, which was a really right-wing government. So, so in that sense, it's different. But but there are some similarities there in the fact, I think, that what I was mentioning, like this kind of like need for the embodiment of national sovereignty. Like in the case of Lenin, is like real actual body, right? but the monuments, like this production of multiple bodies that can be in different places, is kind of like this materialization of sovereignty.
Yeah, that's a very thank you very much for your talk. Just a very short question. I was just wondering whether there have been any incidents of vandalism against statues, like physical kind of efforts to destroy the statues or different symbols related to Martin.
Oh, good. If I had planted that question, that would have been this one. So that's I kind of expected this. So not to these big monuments, but to these small monuments that proliferated, these little busts to Marti that started proliferating in the beginning of the socialist period. They're actually before the revolution. They were every school in Cuba had to have a little bust, but now that they are like everywhere. So you see at some point you have like busts next to each other in Cuba. I don't know. I think it didn't happen here in the Soviet Union, but there's like these block-based Committee of Defense of Revolution, which is like a neighbors committee that celebrates Marti as well. So they always put like a little bust of Marti. So there's busts of Marti everywhere, and these busts have been vandalized. I think so. That's like a CDR bust. There have been vandalized, yes, and not the big statues, but God, can we go back a little bit? So these busts are very often vandalized, and no, not that much. Okay, so yes, okay, this one, yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So and it's very funny because it was like a big question for me, because people respect Marti so much. Why do they break these little busts, right? And because I don't think it's just the fact that there's less surveillance regarding the busts. I think it's also the fact that people do not recognize Marti in these busts. So I found in the press throughout the 80s, 70s and 80s letters to the major newspapers, the equivalent of the Pravda, where people complained that the busts did not do justice to Marti, they don't look like Marti, etc. So, and I asked many people, so like, what do you think of these busts? They're like, oh, I don't think of Marti when I see these busts. I think of like the party, I think of the director of my school, the principal of my school. So people have like, they vandalized Marti apparently, but I've never talked to someone who actually told me I vandalized Marti. But apparently people don't associate that with Marti.
So it's not an effort to somehow question Martin's, I don't know, status as national hero?
No, because that was a big question for me, because my whole point is that everybody in Cuba, it's like it became kind of like this unquestionable thing. Like Marti is not to be questioned. It's like, how come people break these busts? And that's what it's kind of like I go like along like Benjamin's lines. It's just like the mass reproduction of these busts just make them lose any power, whereas the big monuments like make them keep like somehow the aura that these don't. Actually, there's like a film from 1964 called The Death of a Bureaucrat that starts with this guy who creates a machine to make busts of Marti, and the machine breaks and he goes into the machine to fix it, and the machine swallows him and he becomes a bust himself. And this is just another interesting thing. It's like there's an organization in Miami organized an act on one of Marti's birthday to put little posters on Marti's busts throughout the island, saying that he was not the intellectual author of the revolution. So this is the guy who organized this event. He in Miami. He has friends in Cuba who do that. So he showed me those pictures, and so I think extra images. So these are images of Marti in Miami. I think. Oh yes, so these are some vandalized busts. And there's this where most probably there was a bust of Lenin here too with Marti. I have no idea who the third person would have been, but this is something you see a lot in Cuba today, like empty pedestals.
There would never be Marti and Che alongside each other.
In little busts,
yeah.
Very rarely.
Any kind of representation.
Well, in the Plaza de la Revolución, there's the big statue of Marti, and then there is like that cast iron thing. Yeah, but that's it, basically. But there were very few Che busts. Yeah, Che is a more controversial figure in Cuba because many people use him as an image against the state, right? So they say that would have been the good socialism and Fidel was a bad socialism. And it's everybody. There's this rumor that Fidel had him killed, and that basically, and everybody knows that they fought at some point. So, but and other minor figures would show up, but the main one was Marti all the time.
And has there been any monumentalization or any discussion of monumentalizing Fidel since his departure?
You mean throughout the revolution or since his death?
Well, especially since his death, but throughout as well.
No, throughout. I mean, he made a point of prohibiting it. So someone put a bust of Fidel Castro in a major street in Havana, like 3 weeks or so in the first month of the triumph of the revolution. He had it removed, and there was like a strong order against any kind of cult of living personalities in Cuba. So this is so the revolution comes to power in 1959. So there's like two ghosts there. One is of course Stalin. So there's like the period of de-Stalinization. So they wanted to avoid that, right? And second is the figure of Trujillo, the dictator of Dominican Republic, who's next door, who also had this cult of personality. Like he even renamed the capital city of the Dominican Republic after himself. And his mother was officially declared like the benefactor mother of all the Dominican Republic, etc. So there was this fear of Stalin and Trujillo that was very clear. So and afterwards, very few, like since the death, as far as I know, people have not been talking about monuments yet. But they have started celebrating Fidel way more. I went there right after his death, and I was really impressed, like with the amount of things on TV that people would not say before, like his birthplace, for instance, was not a well-known place, even though it was a museum already, but nobody knew of it, and very few people ever visited it. And then there was like special shows about it, and you had like interviews of people saying like, oh, when Fidel was born, his weight was like extra big or whatever, and so that showed he had a big destiny, and that I had never seen that before.
Wow, so there is this kind of memorialization.
Yes, not in the form of monuments yet, but memorialization, yeah. So, but it's still very recent, so I'm not.
Yeah, it's interesting, this phenomenon of leaders who intervening to stop their own monumentalization. It sort of makes me think of like Tsereteli, this Georgian sculptor who was a favorite sculptor of Yuri Rushkov, who was a former mayor of Moscow, and he kept making Putin sculptures, and he kept sort of presenting them as Putin, and Putin was always like, I don't want you. Monument, thanks, but we're not going to put that up because that would be a bit too much. And so Tsereteli's studio, has anyone been to Tsereteli's studio and museum?
Is it the one opposite Pushkin? No.
Yeah, it's further up. It's like it's next to it's in the building of the Academy of Fine Arts, and it's full of like just sort of discarded Putin busts hanging around.
Discarded, putting.
Yeah. So if you want to, And then also, sort of, Belarus a few years ago was full of Lukashenko kind of images everywhere. Lukashenko was hanging off buildings with his sort of comb-over haircut, his distinctive comb-over. And then last year there was no Lukashenko. Lukashenko presumably had made himself disappear. Presumably had issued some sort of order that you have to take.
Yeah, there's a certain way of, a certain kind of like congratulatory way of like actually not denying to be celebrated like that. But there's like all these indirect ways, right? So like this picture of Marti blessing him. So the association between Fidel and Marti is very, very strong. So I think that was the way that if there was any kind of cult of personality there was through images like that, like young Fidel being blessed by Marti, which is a very strange picture because he was like supposedly arrested for leading revolt against the government, and they let him pose like in the middle of the police station with like beautifully with the Marti photo in the back. So I think that's how it operated.
I just wanted to say that my favorite, there's a metonymic monumentalization comparative project for us to do one day when the Polish current government recedes or is murdered in some sort of hopeful scenario, is when as some of you probably know, the current Polish state is ruled by this kind of puppet figure, well, by this sort of grey eminence, who is the twin brother of the former Polish president who was killed in Smolensk in a plane crash in 2010. And of course, the current Polish government accused the Putin of having, and the previous Polish government of having clubbed together to kill the former president. The former president is the identical twin of Jarosław Kaczynski, who is the leader of the current ruling party. But who has not installed himself in any of the main offices of state. So he's the leader of the governing party, but he's installed somebody else as the president, who was elected as his candidate, and somebody else as the prime minister. But it's absurdly evident that all the decisions are made there. And there's a sort of famous satirical program in which sort of the whole state and everybody goes to queues to see him in the office of his private political party headquarters, which is in sort of the suburbs of Warsaw, including the president, who's always queuing to get to see the leader of the main party, but he never gets let in. And the secretary keeps getting his name wrong, so he's called.
So he's like a living monument, right?
He's a living monument. But the best thing is that since his party came to power in 2015, which is 5 years following the death of his twin brother, his identical twin brother, they have, of course, started putting up statues to his twin brother. None of which look very much like his twin. I mean, they're sort of just slightly recognizable, and distinctly the ones that are put up look more like the one that's still alive than the one that's dead. So I mean, this is taking that you can always count on the polls to take these kinds of phenomena which occur in other contexts and make them even more absurd and sort of and grotesque and morbid than they.
So I have a question. Do you guys remember any kind of jokes about monuments here in Moscow? Because like a Cuban friend told me that this joke of in which Fidel comes back with Raúl and Martí says, "Oh, I asked you to bring a horse, not an ass." He told me a Soviet version of that before, and I think it had to do with like Brezhnev. So, and I don't remember the details anymore. But it was a Cuban friend who studied here. So, by the way, there's like there's some jokes that circulated here that were important by Cubans, but it's very interesting because the political humor here seemed like very similar to Cuba's. But this thing about the chateo had been like a national concern from before the revolution, like in as early as like the 30s, major intellectuals were writing essays about how bad political jokes are in Cuba and how they erode all authority. So it's kind of like I think like Cuba in a way like has like two beautiful layers of like political humor. That's like one that's like pre-socialist plus the state socialist like incredibly refined political jokes, political humor.
I mean, surely there's some jokes about the Vladimir statue, right?
The new one.
Yeah.
What statue?
Have you seen this? So this is another one of these metonymic things. There's a statue of Vladimir the Great, who was the founder of the Kievan Rus, which is sort of supposedly the founding state of Russia.
Yeah. Where's the statue?
It's like near the Kremlin, like
that big one? Oh, okay. I didn't know it was Vladimir. Okay.
And it's a sort of incredibly, it's a very ugly sort of human statue,
Yeah.
lit up by these kind of like city lights underneath it. And it was erected just sort of 2 years ago, at a time when I suppose the idea was that now Moscow was doing like Zariag here, a lot of the Bushka style statues. There must be some sort of jokes about that. And this is also obviously a stand-in for Vladimir Putin.
Maybe more like memes just
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose it's all about. I suppose the joke doesn't speak anymore. It's written down on the copy meme, so you can't really tell the jokes. You have to look at it on the screen with the writing.
Yeah.
The joke is read. The joke is read now rather than said.
And I heard that the big Peter I statue was actually, the guy tried to sell it to Latin American countries. It was supposed to be like a Columbus statue, right?
Yeah.
And nobody accepted it, so nobody bought it. So.
Well, he tried to sell it to New York first.
Oh, it's New York.
He had various allies in New York, but then Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump. He was going to sell it to Donald Trump came to Moscow. He loved Tsereteli's statues, and he got very excited about them. So he invited Tsereteli to give a presentation in Trump Tower of his statue, and he was going to put it up on the Upper West Side in that sort of Trump development. And he almost did it, and he provided the financing for the Columbus statue in New York. And then Rudy Giuliani bizarrely intervened. This was in 1997 to prevent what he called the Tseretelization of Manhattan. So Donald Trump was almost responsible for bringing this guy to sort of the Ruskavization of New York. And I'm surprised.
They sold another statue.
And they did sell. Well, I think eventually they put up in Ohio. They also put one up in Ohio. Oh no, they sold one twin. What is it, like a tier?
Yes.
Where is that one?
Somewhere where it was like ex-military zone.
Okay.
I just one other thing I forgot to mention in the introduction is that you are doing so Joao's embarking speedily or gradually on a project about
slowly
Cubans,
thinking about it.
about Cubans in the Soviet Union and Cubans in Russia. So
I should know anyone.
You do?
No, I'm
Well, we can keep the conversation more informally as opposed to like
Yeah.
here, like. Oh, thank you.
Okay, well thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot, guys. So we're going to keep.
Sorry. Yes, that is. It's an intimate setting, but very.
Can we go to the street like?
Carry on. Well, why not? I suppose we work just sitting here like panel mode. Do you? And are they going to deal with all of this stuff?
Yeah, I don't.
You're also being streamed live.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?